So, Dylan, how does geospatial technology, particularly its spatial component, influence project planning, execution, reporting, and decision making in these telecommunications projects?
Sure. Kind of multifaceted. Once you really dive into a large scale telecom project, pretty much everything has a geospatial component. So, like I mentioned, there's a lot of grant funding coming down for last mile connectivity, serving the unserved, rural folks who don't have great internet access. There's obviously a lot of funds to kind of connect those folks. So, obviously, that has a geospatial component. So, what addresses are unserved, which ones are served.
If you're a project manager in the architecture, engineering, or construction sectors, you're going to want to watch this episode. One of the things we need to do as project managers is track our projects and monitor their progress. And one of the ways we can do that is by using data. Well, in this episode, I have with me Dylan Sheets. Dylan is a PMP, Senior Project Manager at Timmons Group, and his focus is GIS and geospatial work. And he's going to talk about how he's been able to use geospatial technologies in telecommunications projects as a project manager to really keep an eye on the project, have all the information in one location, kind of have one source of truth. And he's going to give you some examples from his projects that can definitely apply to your project. Really looking forward to sharing this one with you. I'm Anthony Fasano, and this is the AEC Project Management Podcast. Right now, I'd like to welcome our guest onto the show for today. Dylan Sheets is a PMP and Senior Project Manager at Timmons Group. Dylan, welcome to the AEC Project Management Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Anthony. I appreciate your time this afternoon.
Yeah, we're looking forward to chatting with you and diving into kind of project management, GIS, telecommunications. But before we get there, Dylan, tell us a little bit about your background, kind of what led you to project management, specifically in telecommunications at Timmons.
Sure. So I started working at Timmons Group actually right out of college, graduated and pretty quickly found Timmons Group within a couple months, and kind of started out at the bottom of the totem pole, essentially, working in the field, doing a variety of kind of utility mapping. So, going around, just walking around cities, mapping things like water meters, fire hydrants, manholes, you name it, kind of a little bit of everything. And gradually over the first kind of couple of years of my career, kind of stumbled into managing some of those efforts. I think I was fortunate my organization put a lot of faith in me, saw my work ethic, and trusted me with some management, really. So yeah, just kind of really stumbled into it. And then after a couple of years, I got my PMP back in 2018, I think it was. And from there, really, dove into the project management. I haven't really seen much of the field side of things since then. Kind of at the start of my project management career with Timmons Group, it was a little bit of a mixture of, managing actual field survey efforts, kind of a couple more like IT realm projects that I managed as well, systems integration, systems architecture updates, that kind of thing. So I'd say kind of my bread and butter is the field side, but the kind of IT projects gave me a feel for like how we could be better managing field projects, essentially. So, learning what kind of tools and systems integrations and those kind of things were out there and available to project managers really gave me, like, I guess, kind of a foot up to be able to better utilize those systems in project management when it comes to, field services and ultimately telecommunications.
That's great. I mean, I really think that there should be some kind of process, generally speaking, for project managers in the services industries, that they do have to do some kind of field work out of school. Because to me, I mean, as an engineer, I was a design engineer out of school, but I had worked in college and kind of as a surveyor in the field for summers. And I feel like that was a huge advantage because, like you said, when you see things out there and see how they kind of get physically put together and the kind of tools that are being used, you can kind of get a much better feel when you get in the office for how you could be more helpful, right?
Exactly.
To people out there and things you could do. So
definitely,
if you're listening and if you have the opportunity to either get into the field or get some of your younger professionals into the field, I think it's a really good approach, and they'll be much more well-rounded professionals and project managers if you're able to make that happen.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yeah, and some of the projects that I was managing early on, again, they kind of it's kind of back and forth between typical, GIS projects and IT projects and field management. But ultimately, I guess around like 2020, actually right around the pandemic, started managing a statewide joint use effort. Joint use is a term that we use pretty frequently in the projects that I'm running, which is basically just saying that, you know, one utility typically will own a pole, which obviously relates to telecommunication pretty heavily. But that pole serves, multiple uses or joint uses, meaning it can, carry electricity, carry fiber, cable telecommunications, that kind of thing. So that's kind of how I really got started in the telecommunications effort, was just managing the field inventories for joint use efforts. And I've probably a lot of people are aware there's a lot of federal and state funding coming down for fiber projects specifically. So that's kind of how I stumbled into the telecommunications realm initially, I'll say.
So, Dylan, how does geospatial technology, particularly its spatial component, influence project planning, execution, reporting, and decision making in these telecommunications projects?
Sure. Kind of multifaceted. It really, once you really dive into a large scale telecom project, pretty much everything has a geospatial component. So, like I mentioned, there's a lot of grant funding coming down for last mile connectivity, serving the unserved, rural folks who don't have great internet access. There's obviously a lot of funds to kind of connect those folks. So obviously that has a geospatial component. So, what addresses are unserved, which ones are served, which ones are eligible for funding, what kind of funding are they eligible for? And then, as you're kind of going through and figuring out that information and trying to serve the unserved, it's also, okay, well, how many other addresses are we passing as we build out our network to serve those unserved? And how many, other potential customers can we tie into the network? And how large does the network have to be to serve those folks? So kind of from a starting point, a lot of it is around, just finding your customers and understanding what kind of funding is out there to support that. Once you kind of get past the planning phases, or that particular planning phase, and you're trying to get into your network planning, it's, okay, now I can use GIS to locate headaches that I want to avoid. So are there utility conflicts? Are there any like gas lines that I want to avoid? Are there any big electric transmission lines that I want to avoid? Any physical barriers like rivers, interstates, railroads, soil conditions? I mean, all of this has a geospatial component, and ultimately there is geospatial data out there for just about all these things that we can use for planning purposes.
Dylan, before you go forward, I probably should have said this, but for people not familiar with, the term geospatial, I mean, really, from what I would take away, and not be having as much expertise as you, but really, it's basically location. Like, for example, a GPS, a Google Earth. Is that how you would describe like geospatial? How would you describe it?
Yeah, exactly. So Google Earth, Google Maps is probably what people come to think of initially when you hear geospatial or GIS. Goes quite a bit further than that, but that's a great kind of foot into the door to the GIS realm, is thinking about it as a Google Earth type thing. Pulling in KMZs of various data. So obviously, you can see a lot in Google Earth. You can see, well, I've got railroads here, I've got transmission lines, that kind of thing. But there's also a lot of like physical data that exists around those things that you can pull into a map, so that you're not reliant on just looking for imagery. And then you can do all sorts of spatial analysis, saying like, all right, here's my theoretical network, now intersect this against gas lines, transmission lines, rivers, roads, etc., and see where my pain points are going to be, essentially.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, one of the reasons that we wanted to have Dylan on the show is because I think as a project manager in today's world, data is so important, right? For the planning of your project, for the executing of your project. So if you aren't an expert in these types of things, you certainly want to have someone on your team or someone that you can reach out to that can maybe help you, especially early on in projects, project planning, to kind of get a lay of the land, if you will, understand where things are, there's just so many tools out there that can make this easier for you and give you the right information ahead of time on projects, so we don't run into things down the road. And so I think it's really important that you're aware that these tools are available to you. And I'm sure some of you might have it within your own firm or organization that you don't know about, an expert, or you may have to go out and sub some of it out. But it can be really, really eye opening and really help you with your planning purposes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Dylan, what are some of the key challenges in managing large-scale telecommunications projects? And maybe you could share a specific example for us where GIS maybe helped with some kind of a challenge or improve the project outcome.
Sure. So one of the projects that I'm personally working on at the moment is kind of a statewide fiber build out. Really, it's across about 25 counties in the state of Virginia. One of the biggest hurdles that I'll say we run into is a project of that scale. And I should also add that these counties are pretty spread out. They're not all contiguous. So there's some in far southwest Virginia. There's some in Northern Virginia, Central Virginia, Eastern Virginia. You end up touching a lot of different entities, whether that's, different pole owner co-ops or privately held utility companies, different DOT jurisdictions, different, gas line owners and other utility owners that you're working with to try to avoid conflicts and that type of thing. It makes the project management piece difficult, I'll say. You got data and permits and communication all being stored in different locations. And, there's different workflows that have to be adhered to depending on who you're working with. It's just a lot of inconsistencies across the project that have to be kind of managed and ultimately known. Everyone on the stakeholders on the project and the folks who are working with these agencies need to be aware that just because one thing worked over here in this side of the state, it's not necessarily going to be apples to apples and work the same over in, another portion. So one of the kind of particular and specific instances relates to pole owners, which is one of the big kind of components to this project. We're trying to attach, fiber aerially in most cases because it's more cost effective than going underground in many cases. And we, end up working with 5 or 6 different pole owners. And again, they all operate very differently. They've all got very different maintenance workflows, I would say. Some pole owners are very meticulous about their maintenance and everything's in great shape, and you can kind of attach fiber relatively easily, without too much what we call make ready, which means, engineering needs like pole upgrades that have to happen for us to attach fiber.
So these are like electric or cable companies or things of that nature?
Well, pole owners. So typically like rural co-ops, because again, a lot of what we're doing is rural fiber, building the last mile to rural customers that don't have good internet, basically.
Gotcha.
So what that really ultimately comes down to is, some locations and some pole owners in pockets of the state, it's relatively easygoing, and you might have a pole replacement here or there. And then in other cases, especially as you get more and more rural, there's a lot of things like pole replacements that need to happen. Taller poles, mid-span poles. Anyway, keeping track of all this, obviously there's a spatial component to it, and obviously there's also a cost component to all this, right? The more needs the poles have, the more expensive it's going to be, the more expensive your plant is going to end up being in those locations. So one thing that we've done is taken to using like cost estimation practices to, analyzed, all right, these poles are all 35 feet, all the spans are greater than 300 feet, that kind of thing, to do some predictive modeling around, okay, over the course of this mile, this is kind of the make ready cost that we anticipate you seeing. Putting that all in a GIS viewer so that can be shared with stakeholders across the project, so that you can kind of say like, all right, if you do want to build to this area, this is roughly how much you're going to cost or expect to pay in terms of like this make ready engineering. So that's a little bit in the weeds, but it is a good example of one of the biggest challenges that we've run into on this particular project.
Yeah, it's a great example. And I think a couple of other things I can think of off the top of mind would be like a roadway project where maybe the road is going into different municipalities, right? Or different ownership levels and there's different utilities. Could be something like this could be valuable, like a utility project, right? Where you're running easements through people's properties. I would imagine that there would be some big potential there for streamlining of coordination. I mean, I think what I like about these technologies is that when you're working on a project that's so big, like the one you just described, any small improvements to your coordination, data collection, communication, right? It's going to drastically improve the project from a budgetary and a scheduling standpoint, right? So that's where I think, hopefully if you're listening and you're a PM and you don't have access to some of these tools yet, maybe something that you and your organization can really look into, because to me, it's like a high leverage area. Like you improve with some kind of technology that can really streamline this, your projects get done maybe faster, maybe cheaper, but also just maybe better, or one way or the other. So I think there's a lot of good benefits. And if you're watching this on the video stream, we're hopefully going to be mixing in some images here of some of the projects that Dylan's worked on. If you're on the audio, you can get over to YouTube and check it out, because I know some of this stuff is visual. So, Dylan, what strategies do you use to transform complex GIS data? Because I know people are thinking, oh man, I'm going to get a lot of data here, into meaningful visualizations like maps and graphs and dashboards for your stakeholders.
Yeah. So one of the things that we'll likely touch on in a little bit is kind of systems integration pieces. So a lot of what we try to do, and admittedly, it's not the easiest thing in the world, but is keeping the GIS as like a central repository for just about everything, really. So, a lot of this data and analysis, all, like I said earlier, ties back to geospatial locations, right? Whether it's poles or linear features for permits, whatever the case is. We try to keep all of that information in the same data so that it's all in one place, all in a central repository. And all of that data can essentially be set up, via different maps and dashboards specifically for the type of audience that you're trying to communicate to. So if we're trying to communicate to our field folks, what poles need to be surveyed or what areas need to be surveyed, we've got, several attributes or like text fields in the data to kind of clue them in on what needs to happen. On that same data, we might have permitting information for a different set of stakeholders, but again, it all ties to the same location. Or we might have cost information for network planners so they can see, okay, I need to avoid this area because this is going to be really expensive. So when you have all of that information in one place, it's really easy to get lost in the details, really. So you have to find some way to kind of keep it simple. And one of the ways that we do that is, setting up different maps and applications and dashboards for different users. So again, it's all tying back to the same data, but that data, a poll layer might have 100 different like text fields on it for various purposes. Right. If you send somebody in there without hiding certain things, they're gonna, probably immediately be overwhelmed and want to close the application. So setting things up so that they're only getting the information that they need while maintaining, some sort of consistency across the board. So probably the easiest thing that I can think of in that regard is like keeping symbology like pretty straightforward. So right. If we're trying to show data based on like anticipated cost, something super simple like green, pretty low cost, yellow, kind of in the middle of the road, and red is like, you want to avoid this area if you can. We do things like, we've got a map that highlights literally individual poles that we think are going to be really expensive and show those in red so the designers can see, okay, I want to avoid this area. Then we might have the same data, but kind of displayed in dashboards for more senior level, executive level stakeholders. Maybe don't necessarily need to be down at like the map level, but they want to see, dashboards that kind of inform them of project costs, whether it's at the, project level, county level, even smaller than that in some cases. But just keeping things consistent where you can, as well as, like I said, trying to hide some of the really minutia details from the folks who don't need to be in the weeds that much.
I think this is great. I think this is a really important part of this conversation because I think one of the kind of resistors to people adopting these technologies is like information overload, right? Like, okay, I'm going to have all this data. Like, what do I do with it? How do I process it? And I think what you're talking about is really important. I know in the civil infrastructure world where I lived as a designer, you need to often communicate things to people like the public, like you mentioned, like executives or leadership, and to be able to take it and distill it down into a simple plan with a couple of colors on it or a simple table with some information on it is extremely valuable for the project manager in communicating with different stakeholders, the mayor, right? Or like, the local politicians or whatever the case may be. Here are some poles that we think are going to be really expensive. If you want to, if you want to make changes here, we're going to have to need additional funds or something along those lines, right? So I think what's nice about this is you can get the data and then create ways for it to be more easily digestible for your stakeholders. And it's like, taking a complex thing, I guess you could say, and simplifying it for people, which to me can make or break a project, quite frankly.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, yeah, we end up using a lot of these dashboards in meetings with the public sector. So if we're going into a county board of supervisors meeting, we'll take this kind of data with us. Maybe we don't always need it, but if we start getting detailed questions, we've got the graphics to kind of support and show exactly the issues that we're running into and why timelines are getting lengthened for this kind of work to happen, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's great for a variety of reasons, really.
For sure. So, Dylan, what are some of the emerging trends in GIS and telecommunications project management that would be interesting to our audience?
So there's so many technology, new technologies and new applications in the GIS realm. It's a little bit hard to keep track of, even for somebody that spends every day living in this stuff. One of the big things that I think is like the biggest payoff that I can really enumerate on is just the integration. So it's not even necessarily like the latest and greatest GIS technology, but it's really using GIS as like a central repository for a variety of aspects of project management, project planning. So again, it might not be like super, super cutting edge, but if you can get all of your systems to talk to each other through GIS, which is really what we strive for on a number of our projects, it just improves the project as a whole. It makes, gives, like we were talking about, various stakeholders access, but only the kind of access that they really need. Some of the examples that I was thinking through as I was prepping for this, again, kind of tying back to the telecom realm, but poles specifically. So I spend a lot of my time and a lot of our team's time talking about poles and figuring out what needs to happen in order for fiber to attach to them. So in terms of system integration, you start with just a pole point on a map, right? Or thousands of pole points on a map. Once you have kind of surveyed that, and figured out, all right, this is kind of what needs to happen. And yes, we are interested in attaching this pole, or no, we're not. You can join that pole to things like permitting trackers and permitting information, specifically coming out of something called the National Joint Use Notification System. That's, one application then that stakeholders don't have to log into separately. If they can log into the GIS and they can see the information directly from engines, that's one less application that they have to spend their time going into because that's within the GIS. Same thing for engineering documents and costs. If we can integrate our pole data with a pole owner's engineering documentation and all the cost information and design information, that's one or two or three less systems that people have to kind of go diving through hoops to get access to if we can tie that all back into the GIS. And permitting is really a similar exercise. So we've got linear features in our geospatial data that are really tracked at like a permit level. So, we might have a 2-mile long linear segment along a road, and it's okay, this is our DOT permit number, and here's its number, here's its status, and we tie that into, in our case, a smart sheet that we use for tracking those permits and making updates. So again, just one less application that people then have to go to if they can just go straight to the GIS and get their updates there. Ties into construction as well. If we can if we can tie our GIS data into like construction trackers, we can visualize where the construction's taking place, how much it's costing. If we have, good data on that, we can visualize where the inspections are happening, where the violations and the fixes are happening, and where permits are getting closed out. Again, all of this stuff has a geospatial component, so
Right.
it makes sense to kind of tie it all back to the same system and point of reference.
Yeah, I think that's great because I think sometimes today, instead of the answer being more and newer technology, it could be leveraging the existing technology and integrating with others to make
Right.
your life easier as a PM or as an organization as a whole. And I think that that's great because I think that sometimes the urge is to let's go get a new software, but we're not really totally using the one we have necessarily, right? And I like the idea of this like one source of truth with the GIS, with like just all your information in one place for the PM and for the stakeholders that may be working on the project to make it easier for them to access, which is awesome. And I think that, again, when you get to a project of this magnitude, having it all in one place, and if people aren't jumping around to different things, it's just saving you a lot of time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And time is money on your projects. And also, it's maybe helping to reduce errors, because if you have to start looking at different locations for different numbers and different things, again, that could also cause problems. So I think this idea of creating this one database that can be updated with all this information is great. And when I did work in the stormwater field, we saw the same thing where you might use like a GIS system for a municipality to go through and tag all their structures, right? All their drainage structures with all their information, like last time it was cleaned, when it was installed last, what kind of piping is it, what size is it? And it's just all in one database right there for you.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And so I think that if you're using GIS or thinking about using it, you really have to make sure that you want to get the most out of it on your projects and use it as a way to really have all of your information in front of you, which does create almost like a project dashboard for you as the PM to kind of manage things effectively.
Yep, exactly.
So, Dylan, how can AEC project managers kind of leverage geospatial technology to improve some of their workflows on their projects and just make them go more smoothly?
I think a lot of it is kind of what we just talked about. Like if you can get all of your systems or a lot of your systems talking to the GIS, it just really reduces the number of hoops that you have to jump through. And again, that's not the easiest thing in the world, right? You have to have good GIS analysts, you have to have good systems integrations people, you have to have people that know where all these things live currently and be able to work with the folks who are trying to tie all of these things together. So it's, and full, honesty here, not all of our projects are run, perfectly through GIS, but it is something that we strive for. So I think, streamlining
your usage, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like, again, the more systems and applications that we all rely on, which I think at some point is kind of inevitable, but if you can take back 30 minutes of your day that normally you're using to log into remote machines and different applications and do your multi-factor authentication, it makes your life easier, but it also gives you some time back and puts all the information in one place, which I think everyone can kind of value.
All right, Dylan, now it's time for our final question. We call it the PM pitfalls question. What would you say is one of the bigger PM pitfalls that you've seen that project managers deal with on projects? And how do you recommend maybe overcoming it, avoiding it, dealing with it?
Yeah, and this, I hate to kind of harp on it, but it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, especially on the project that I'm working on now. It's the kind of the tendency to silo data and information. I think, especially when you're on a project with multiple project managers and, multiple project managers from multiple vendors and multiple organizations, they all kind of have their own way of running things and frequently tend to kind of silo that data and information in their own, internal systems and sometimes, on their desktops, whatever the case is. And I think a lot of it is well intentioned, but when you're on especially in a very large project, that gets to be very dangerous and very inefficient. It makes, sometimes it seems like PMs on our team spend half a day just trying to get to the right information. Again, we've talked about how GIS can help solve this. Obviously, there's other systems and project management solutions out there to help solve these issues as well. But I do think that GIS can kind of be on the forefront of that and, solving some of those issues. Specifically on the project that I'm on right now, not only are we looking at various, smart sheets and Excel sheets, but we're constantly diving into like permitting portals. So whether it's the National Joint Use Notification Systems or DOT permitting portals or railroad permitting portals, other utility portals, pole owner design suites. I know I've kind of harped on it, but just the time that it takes to get into all of those things and remember how to navigate them, the more that you can kind of integrate those information repositories, really the more dividends it's going to pay for kind of stakeholders across the project.
Yeah. And I think your point too is a point that is important from a broader perspective of project management too, in terms of just kind of having all of the information in front of you as a project manager, even like departmentally, right? Like if you're working on a project with 5 different departments in your organization, like if you don't get the geotech information at the right time and you're trying to make decisions about the foundation or whatever the case may be, you're not looking at all the information that you have available to you at the same time. And,
right.
And, kind of a more global example, but that's why when we do our PM development programs, we spend a lot of time on kickoff meetings, right? Like getting everyone together, making sure all the stakeholders are on the same page. And I think you can think of it in the same way from a technology standpoint, right? Like figure out all your information in the beginning of the project. Where's it coming from and how can we kind of consolidate it into one, location type of thing. And I think that's really a big part of project management is like just having everything you need in front of you to be able to execute and then monitor your project along the way. And, the data is critical to that. I mean, the data is how you track your progress on your projects most likely and how you're doing things. So
right.
Lots of good information around that here. So once again, Dylan Sheets. Dylan's a PMP, Senior Project Manager at Timmons Group. Dylan, thanks so much for spending some time with us here on the AEC Project Management Podcast to talk a little about GIS, Geospatial, and how it's related to project management. A lot of good stuff here. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Anthony. I appreciate the opportunity.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dylan. It's fascinating stuff, what he's doing with some of these geospatial technologies. And again, you heard us weave throughout the episode some examples and analogies for projects that you may be able to work on to kind of think about how you can get all your information in one location to help with your tracking, your coordination, and your communication. If you like the video, please subscribe to our channel here. We put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help engineers become better project managers and better leaders. I'll see you next week.